A very good afternoon to everyone here. Thank you for your support and enthusiasm. My name is Yu Tin. I will be your MC for today's CLC lecture, The Water Will Rise, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World. The CLC lecture series is organized by the Center for Livable Cities as part of our mission to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. Today, we are very delighted to have here with us Mr. Jeff Goodell, contributing editor for Rolling Stone and the author of the book, The Water Will Rise. I first knew of Jeff from his book, and he sends a very timely and much needed reminder to all of us that we need to do something about climate change today. And what's equally exciting today is that he will share with us his recent trip to the Antarctica with the scientists to examine the impact of climate change on the Antarctica. After Jeff's presentation today, we'll also have discussion and Q&A sessions moderated by Professor Winston Chow from the Department of Geography, National University of Singapore. So kindly hold all the questions till the Q&A session. Thank you. And with this, let us start the session. Jeff, please.
Let's see if I can make this working. Does this work? Great. Wow. Thank you all for coming. This is really fantastic. This is very inspiring to see so many of you here to listen to me talk about my book and about our world. Thank you to everyone at the Center for Livable Cities for having me here. I'm very grateful to be here talking with you all. I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about why I write about climate change, talk a little bit about my book, some of the lessons that I learned from working on this book, The Water Will Come, about sea level rise. And I just want to start by saying that, climate change is, I think, the sort of central challenge of that humanity has ever faced, that it's going to change everything about our world. It's going to change where we live. It's going to change what we eat. It's going to change how we live. It's going to change our values. It is a profound transformation of our world. And I want to underscore that it's not a future event, something that's going to happen in the decades to come. It will happen in the decades to come, but it's also happening now. It's happening in real time. And the changes that we're seeing are only going to accelerate. And I just want to really underscore this from the very beginning, and I'll talk about that some more, but that's a really important point that I want just to start with. One of the changes that's going to be coming, that we're going to be seeing, is sea level rise. I suppose I should start looking at some slides. Sea level rise is a manifestation of climate change. It's one of the major impacts that you will, of course, all be feeling here, seeing here. And I want to talk about, so I've been writing about climate change for about 20 years. And 10 years ago, nobody really cared about it. It's amazing. I was like as if I were writing about cockroaches or something like that. No one really cared that I was anyone. But things have changed, and now the politics and the impacts and everything are coming together in a way that is making this sort of very relevant to the moment. And the fact that so many of you are here 10 years ago, if I would have been here talking about climate change, there probably would have been 4 people here. So this in itself is testament to how everything is changing. But I've written about many aspects of climate, from the energy part of it. I wrote a book about the coal industry. I've written hundreds of articles for Rolling Stone about where we get our energy. I've written about energy politics. I wrote a book about geoengineering, large-scale attempts not attempts, we haven't done it yet, but the idea that we might be able to cool off the planet by spraying particulate matter into the sky, or other kinds of schemes to engineer our planet to deal with climate change. And I can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A afterwards if you want. But it's this book, The Water Will Come, really came out of a central understanding. It came out of 2 things for me, the reason I wrote this book, that I think are important to say. One is that it became clear to me that we are not going to stop CO2 emissions anywhere near soon enough to avoid the impacts and some of the worst impacts of climate change. That after watching this for 20 years and watching CO2 emissions go up and up and up, and watching the parts per million in the atmosphere continuing to climb and climb and climb, became very clear to me that any fantasy that I might have and others might have that we're going to get our act together as human beings and become good people and take care of the future and reduce the fossil fuel emissions anywhere near fast enough to avert some of the worst impacts was not going to happen. So what are we going to do? And it became clear to me that we're moving into adaptation land, that we are now in, as my friends in the theater business in New York say, when the curtain goes up, you're in the river. Things are happening, you have to deal with it. And that's where we are. We're in the river in a way with climate change. Things are happening, our world is changing fast. And although cutting emissions is really, really important for all kinds of reasons that most of you, if you're here, you probably understand, it's also really important to understand that we're not going to stop the changes. And sea level rise is a particular example of that. No matter what we do with carbon emissions, we're still going to have significant sea level rise in our time. And that became very apparent to me, and I realized that a lot of people, including myself, didn't really grasp that. And the other thing that was the impetus for this book and made me write this was Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And I was in New York at the time, and 9 feet of water came into Lower Manhattan. And that was pretty mind-boggling what 9 feet of water will do. And I was talking to a climate scientist at Columbia who said, well, one way to think about what we just saw with Hurricane Sandy is as a sort of dress rehearsal for sea level rise. So imagine that 9 feet of water, which is 3 meters or so, came into New York, but instead of going away in an hour or two, just stayed there. And that's what New York, Lower Manhattan could look like at the end of the century. And I was like, wow, that's pretty mind-boggling to think about that. And then he said, you really want to blow your mind, go have that same thought experiment in Miami. And I was like, why? And he said, just go and you'll see. And I went. And I was there about 20 minutes, and it became very clear to me that Miami, in any scenario that takes sea level rise seriously, was in huge trouble because you have land that's, anyone who's ever been to South Florida, it's flat as a pancake. You have lots of really expensive real estate built right on the water, and it's all built on Swiss cheese. It's all built on a porous limestone that means that you can't really build seawalls because the water will go right up underneath it. So I spent a few weeks there. I wrote an article for Rolling Stone with a very subtle title, Goodbye Miami. And it caused a bit of a sensation. I tell my kids often that if I'm ever found in a ditch in a car with the brake lines cut, like Karen Silkwood did after she revealed some secrets about the nuclear power industry, very famous story of how she was murdered. I said to my kids, if I'm ever found in a car with cut brake lines, you need to talk to the Miami Real Estate Association, because they were totally not thrilled with my publicly talking about the idea that Miami as we know it today is doomed. But that was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I still believe that, and we can talk more about that the Miami as we know it today, as with many cities as we know them today, are not going to make it through these coming decades as sea levels begin to rise quickly. But that book, that article and being in Miami made me think, okay, so this is what Miami's dealing with. What about the rest of the world? What are they doing? What's the Netherlands doing? What's Venice doing? What is Africa doing? What is Boston doing? What is New York doing? And so that was the genesis of this book. And I went around the world for 4 years looking at sea level rise in various different kinds of places. I went to the Marshall Islands. I went to Lagos, Nigeria. I spent some time with this guy you may recognize. I'm the one on the left, by the way. And it's very surreal. I spent 3 days talking with President Obama in Alaska about sea level rise and about climate change, and it was an extraordinary experience. The idea of sitting down with a president for hours at a time talking about this, kind of surreal, thinking back about it. This was in 2015 during the run-up to the Paris climate agreements when he was trying to gather momentum for Paris climate agreements. He thought of climate change as one of the big legacies of his time in office. So it's surreal thinking about that, but it's not as surreal as thinking about what this conversation would be like with our current president, which would be a little different, I think. But so that was what I did with the book. Went around the world, thought about this stuff, and I want to just talk about some of the things, kind of distill what I learned in that to a couple of things that might be relevant to you in thinking about this, and hopefully prompt you to pick up the book and have a look at it. The first thing that I think is really important to think about when we think about sea level rise and what's coming is this question of the water is going to come. The question is how high and how fast is it going to come in, right? We know that because of the heat that's already built up in the world's oceans and the kind of warming that we already have on the climate, that a certain amount of sea level rise is built in. Last time that Earth's temperatures and CO2 levels are where they are right now, sea levels were 6 meters higher. So that basically means that if we stop all CO2, if everybody quit burning fossil fuels and everything right now, by the time we get to what's called a thermal equilibrium in the Earth, we're going to have 6 meters more of sea level rise. But that could take centuries. But we're going in that direction. And so we're not going to stop the rising water, but there is a question of how fast it's going to come. IPCC reports say 1 meter. A lot of science is heading in a different direction. But I want to show you this. I think this is an important sort of starting point just to show what's been happening on our planet for the last 130 years or so. This is just a little video of real-time temperature changes. And obviously the yellows and the oranges are warming. And just watch as we go through the years together here where the planet is warming most quickly. And you can see the early part of the century, things are pretty stable. Everything's, there's not any kind of dramatic changes. But then right around the middle of the century, we start to see significant warming happening, right? And now as time goes on, the yellow's evenly distributed, but watch what happens now as we get to the recent decades. Right? So, a lot of orange and yellow at the top of the world there, where Greenland is, and some warming down below on the Antarctic Peninsula. But these are the changes that we're seeing, and this is the reason why sea level rise is a significant issue. Because when you think about sea level rise, it's really the big blocks of ice at the top and the bottom of the world, if you want to think about it that way, that are the issue. There's things about thermal expansion, there's mountain glaciers, but all that kind of stuff is basically noise. The question is what's going to happen in Greenland and what's going to happen in Antarctica. And this temperature thing just shows you that a lot of the warmth right now is been amplified in the northern hemisphere and somewhat in the southern hemisphere. What's happening? This is just a chart of some of the recent studies about the high end of sea level rise. And the only point I want to bring up here is that the error bar, or not the error bars, but the high-end scenarios are moving towards more and more sea level rise, the possibility of 2 meters, 3 meters, or in some cases even more. And there's a good reason for that, and that is that up until very recently, everyone thought that the real risk was all in Greenland, what was happening up in the Arctic, and that Antarctica was fine. Antarctica is a big block of ice the size of the United States and Mexico together, but it's pretty stable, nothing really going on there, we're cool, we'll worry about it in 1,000 years, right? But what's happened in the last decade is that scientists have figured out that that's not exactly true, that there are things that are happening. And so the scenario, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but the risks of high end of more than 1 meter of sea level rise have grown exponentially in the last decade or so. But just to show you this is Miami, where I write about it a lot. And this just shows you what 7 feet, which is obviously a little bit around 2 meters of sea level rise looks like in Miami. And this is what's called a bathtub inundation model, but it shows you can see what happens to Miami Beach. It's underwater. You can see that the water comes in through the Everglades from the west and floods out on the interior. You can see that the airport is in big trouble. You can see all that's left is basically what's called the Coral Ridge, an old bit of high ground that's about 14 feet above sea level along the edge there. But that gives you a real sense of what just 2 meters looks like to a place like Miami. And one of the things that I didn't realize until I started doing this book is that I always thought of sea level rise as this long, slow thing. It's been rising right now about 4 millimeters a year. And you think, oh, that's just a little tiny bit. We can deal with that. And it's going to be this long, slow progression. But one of the things that that scientists understand, and that I have come to understand when I was thinking about this book, is that sea level rise has risen in pulses in the past. And this is a great example of it. This thing called Meltwater Pulse 1A, the Younger Dryas right in the middle there. That was 14,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, and that's like yesterday, of course, in Earth history. And for 2 centuries, maybe 3, but certainly for 2, sea level rose about 13 feet, so about, 4 meters a century. So the idea of 4 meters or 13 feet of sea level rise, it happened in 2 centuries in a row, maybe 3. We know that has happened. I'm not saying it's going to happen again, but we know that there's potential for that kind of rise. And one of the big mysteries for scientists who are trying to figure out what the risks are is, where did that water come from? What happened that we had 13 feet or 4 meters of sea level rise in a century? And I don't need to say what 4 meters means to every coastal city, basically, in the world, to Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong, New York, Miami. I mean, that's catastrophic, right? There's basically no scenario that I'm aware of any kind of engineering solution to that kind of rapid sea level rise. And I'm not saying it's going to happen again, but I am saying that it's happened before. And the question is why and where. And the culprit is increasingly turning out to be Antarctica. And this is a ship called the Nathaniel B Palmer, and I was on that ship 3 weeks ago. And if I get a little woozy up here, it's because I still have sort of the sea in I still have sea legs. It's not because I've had martinis this afternoon. But I'm still a little woozy. But I was on this ship for 2 months, and we went to West Antarctica I was with 30 of the best ice and climate and ocean scientists in the world. And we were there on what was explicitly called an emergency research mission, or trip, to look at instability in West Antarctica and what is going on there and what are the possibilities of collapse of these ice sheets in West Antarctica. And I like this picture simply because it shows you the scale of some of these, of the ice there. And these are just icebergs. That's not the actual glacier itself. Those are just icebergs that were floating around. And this is a drone shot. One of the scientists had a drone and sent the drone up, and it's just a really great picture. But we went to look at a glacier called Thwaites Glacier, which is described as the sort of cork in the bottle for the West Antarctic ice sheets. If it goes away, and it's about the size of Florida, if it goes, it is what's stabilizing a lot of West Antarctica. And if it goes, a lot of the rest of West Antarctica can go into the ocean also. And there's a lot of concern about this because, as I said, up until recently, scientists thought, Antarctica is fine. There's no real sign of surface melting there. It's not like Greenland where you can see, I've been to Greenland a number of times, you can see the water melting, the ice melting, the water running off into these moulins, the glaciers calving into the sea. You've all seen pictures of that, I'm sure. Antarctica is a completely different scenario. And what scientists have figured out is that Antarctica, especially West Antarctica, is basically like a big bowl full of ice. And it has what's called a reverse slope, which you can sort of see here, and the glacier meets the ocean at the grounding line there, and there's an ice shelf. And this is sort of what these enormous glaciers looked like. This is obviously, it's hard to grasp the scale of this. I mean, at the back of these glaciers and near the rear where this picture was, the ice would be about 2 miles thick. It's very, big glacier. But it's on a reverse slope. And what scientists have figured out, and the reason they're freaked out, and the reason they spent 30 scientists down there and me to look at this, is because they have realized that as the ocean has warmed up only about 1 degree, tiny amount. This is a great example of small changes having enormous consequences. The ice shelves are starting to break, and the water is starting to get under the glaciers, under the ice. And because it's a reverse slope, once the water gets over that grounding line, it runs down underneath. And as it runs down underneath, it begins to destabilize the glacier. Right? It begins to crack. And there's a thing called marine ice cliff instability, where basically an ice cliff over 100 meters high, which sounds high but really isn't for the scale of these glaciers, can't stand basically without sort of support from beneath. So what the concern is that as this thing begins to fracture, because it's on a reverse slope, the water runs down, and it can be what was essentially a runaway ice collapse. And it's different than what's happening in Greenland or what happens to a popsicle if you drop it on the sidewalk, where you have melting and it takes a certain amount of time for the heat to melt that ice. Here you can have rapid collapse, because you can have this giant pile of ice cubes cracking up and falling into the ocean really fast, like this. And this is precisely what they're concerned about happening. In fact, believe is happening. Some of the best scientists in the world have told me that we're beyond the tipping point on this, that this is going to happen. The only question right now is, what is the time sequence of this? We know the water's getting over the grounding line. We know that's fracturing. We know there's ice cliff instability. The question is, how fast does this whole thing play out? And are there any things like bumps in the ground that can stop the water from running back and slow some of this down? So this time scenario is questionable still right now. But it is happening. And not only is it happening, it was happening while I was there, which was incredible. So this red dot on the left is where I was on that ship that you just saw. That's the Thwaites Glacier right there, the big white on the side, and obviously the dark is the ocean. And we were there at the front of Thwaites Glacier, which that whole thing is Thwaites Glacier, by the way, not just the inside, but that whole thing. On 3/2, so that's March 2nd, we were right there. And on 3/6, we were a few kilometers away, and a 40 by 60 kilometer piece of Thwaites Glacier collapsed, disintegrated. Right there, you can see it. This is satellite pictures. All of a sudden, we're floating around out there in the ship, and all these icebergs come roaring by, and like, what's going on? We didn't really know what was happening until we saw these satellite images. And then we realized, oh my God, this thing is collapsed. This part of this is collapsing right when we're here. It was pretty crazy. And it's not in itself like, I don't want to overstate it. It's not like this was a sign of imminent collapse. This kind of thing does happen from natural processes and things. But it's pretty clear that it's also part of the what this will look like as this larger collapse scenario that I just described begins to play out. And it's very alarming. And while I was there, I emailed the Einstein of ice, who's a guy named Richard Alley, who's a glaciologist at Penn State University, who's arguably, I don't even think arguably, is, I would say, the most respected glaciologist in the world. And by the way, he's a conservative, he's a Republican, so he's not like a crazy liberal activist kind of thing. He's been on all the IPCC reports forever and ever. And we were talking about this and what the implications of this were. And the bottom line of it is he said a remarkable thing to me, which was, because of the processes that we're seeing in motion here, we can't rule out 15 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So that's almost 5 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. Now, I'm not saying that that's likely, but I'm saying that the best ice scientist in the world is telling me that we can't rule that out, which is mind-blowing, right? I mean, that's just mind-blowing. But that's the potential for this kind of collapse and what this could possibly mean. So when I talk about the risks growing and the error bars getting, the high-end scenarios getting bigger, this is exactly why. And this is the kind of thing. Richard also said to me that we don't know for sure, and it's very hard to know because there's no human analog for this. We've never watched massive glacial collapse before. That hasn't happened in the 10,000 years humans have been on the planet. We haven't been sitting around watching and Instagramming collapses of glaciers over time, right? This is a new thing to us. So we don't know what the real signs are of this kind of collapse, but we do know the physics and we do know what we see. And this is why they sent 30 scientists down there. They're going to be doing this for the next 2 years to try to figure out and have a better understanding of exactly what this risk is. So that's point number one. So point number two is that I learned is that I had the idea that, sea level rise would be a problem when there's sharks swimming through the lobby of the Fullerton Hotel, and that'll be a problem. But until then, we're good, right? It's not right. It's not true. Sea level rise causes problems very soon. It's already causing problems in a lot of places. It causes problems with higher and higher tides, right? The tides just get higher and higher incrementally, and that causes a little bit more flooding each time. So that in itself is a manifestation of sea level rise. It's just a more increasing what people call sunny day flooding, just because instead of having sunny day floods twice a month, you have sunny day floods 7 times a month, and then you have them 10 times a month, and then you have them, the water before came up to your first step, and then 3 years later, the water's coming up a little bit higher than your first step, and then 3 years later, it's coming up a little bit higher, and that's begins to change the dynamics of how you think about where you live. You have a big problem with what's in that water. If you don't have really good municipal sewage systems, you don't have pretty things in that water, right? You have septic tanks that flood, you have bacteria that get into the water, you have kids playing in the water, I went wandering through the streets of Miami one day in a kind of ruralish neighborhood where they had septic systems, and I just thought it was, I wasn't thinking about this, and it was water up to my knees, and I was talking to some of the residents about how they feel about it, and I happened to bump into a scientist friend of mine on the way out, and he said, "Are you insane?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You're walking through this water like in your normal shoe." I just had like sneakers on, Nikes on, and he had rubber like waist boots. And I said, "Why?" And he said, because I just sampled this water, and the bacteria count was 30,000 times the safe limit of the public health department. So basically, I was walking in water with, and I was like, oh. So I took like 7 showers that night, and I've survived, obviously, but it brings up a lot of not pretty issues about disease and things like that. It also brings up real questions about real estate value, economics, because we're already starting to see this change happening in the US and people moving away from coastlines, not necessarily because the water is all of a sudden in their living room and it wasn't 3 weeks ago, but because they've read a book called The Water Will Come and they realize, maybe I should think differently about this. And maybe my house won't be as valuable in 25 years as it is today. And maybe I should say, I'm getting the hell out of here now because this is all of my money is in my house, and I'm going to sell now. And that's people are beginning to factor this into thinking about the value of the property that they own in coastal areas all around the world, and that is only going to accelerate. There's no question. When I walk around Miami Beach right now, I look at it as a landscape of stranded assets. I just look at these buildings and condos that sell for $10 million. They're not going to be worth anything in some future moment. When that future moment is, I don't know. But there's going to be a massive depreciation of coastal real estate. And how do you game that, how you think about that, is up to each individual. I know people who've decided that they're going to stay in their properties and they don't care if they lose several $1,000,000 because they love where they live and they have several $1,000,000 to spare. I know people who have sold their houses, 2 years ago because they've learned about some of the impacts and risks of sea level rise, and they're like, I can't lose $10,000. I want to sell now at the peak of the market, or what may be the peak of the market, and get out before I lose anything. So everyone has their own ideas about risk, but it's beginning to happen. And when you look at real estate risk, around the world, two of the places that have the highest risk are Hong Kong and Singapore, because of the value of the real estate and the value of the real estate that is at risk. And how this will play out, like I said, I don't know. But what happens when people start to sell is that when people start to leave, is that house property values depreciate. And they depreciate at exactly the time when cities and counties need more money to build coastal defenses, to put up seawalls, to improve the septic systems, all the things that one needs to do, raise roads, all the things that one needs to do in order to buy more time in these kinds of situations. So they're starting to lose money at exactly the time when they start to need to spend more money. And that's a very, very, very scary scenario for any kind of politician or city official trying to deal with the magnitude of the changes that are coming this way. And of course, the other thing that as people start to leave coastal areas is that you have refugees. You have people leaving. Not everybody has a $10 million condo on Miami Beach, right? A lot of people who will be leaving coastal areas have nowhere to go. Right? Here we are in Singapore, lovely place. I love, you love, presumably. But you're surrounded by, you have a lot of low-lying island nations and around you. You have a city like Jakarta, which is not only was the water rising, but the city is sinking. So it's happening doubly fast because all this is about the relationship between the land and the sea, right? Jakarta just last week decided they're going to move their government offices to higher ground. Jakarta is a city in big, big, big trouble when it comes to thinking about this. And where are all those people going to go? Where are the people from the Marshall Islands going to go? Where are the people in Vietnam going to go as Vietnam begins to suffer these same consequences? So that's a big issue with this, thinking about the consequences of even modest levels of sea level rise. Another point I really want to make is that billions of dollars are going to be spent on adaptation and preservation. Some of it will be well spent, but a lot of it will not. We're going to throw away tons of money on dumb shit ideas about how to protect our coastlines and our cities. And I saw this for myself while I was reporting this. So one not crazy idea, but very expensive idea is what they're doing in Miami Beach, where they're basically spending $500 million to improve drainage, raise some streets, put in pumps, do things like that. And you can argue $500 million is not that much money, but it's only about a 20-block area they're working on. It's changed the landscape of the town, of the community there, because they're raising roads, and it's like all of a sudden it's like you're like on drugs as you're walking around, because you're like, oh, I'm going up and I'm going down, I'm tilting, and it's changed the feeling of it. And residents are getting upset, and they've actually stalled the project because there's been so much protests, and they don't want any more tax increases, and it's just a great example of even sort of well-meaning projects being troubled. And this pumping and drainage scenario has helped in Miami Beach, no question about it, but it's only a very short-term fix. You can't keep pumping the water back into the ocean, of course, unless you have somewhere else to put it, because it's just going to come flowing right back in, right? So the idea of just like pumping the water back out into the ocean so it comes back in, you don't have to think about it very long to realize that there's limits to that, right? This is a picture I took in New Jersey. You can elevate buildings, so obviously. Any building can be elevated. This is a great example of an elevated building. This person's going to be fine, right, for a while. I think they're safe. But elevating a building is cool, and you can look out over everything, but you can watch this fish swim by underneath you and all that. But like if the houses around you are not elevated, and they're like full of like God knows what, and they're halfway in the water, and the roads to your house, you're gonna surf or jet ski to your house. How are you gonna get there, right? And what does it mean if the airport around you is underwater or is difficult to access? So the idea of just saving yourself sounds appealing, but when you really start to think about it, it's not so appealing unless you like living by yourself in an elevated house with moldy fish, swimming all around you kind of idea, unless that's your, kind of fantasy. But it's easy to forget that livable places are communities. And if everybody elevated their house 12 feet like that, that would be cool, probably. It would help. And they did something with the streets and all that. But that's not what's happening in Jersey. They're all taking care of themselves. And that's a whole different thing. You can build walls, right? Lots of places have walls. You have seawalls here all over the place. Walls are a tried and true way of keeping water out. And in lower Manhattan, after Hurricane Sandy, they had this idea about building the Big U, a $10 billion wall around lower Manhattan. It's kind of stalled now for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. But walls are very problematic also because you have, first of all, a big social equity issue. Like if you're living on 40 or 39th Street, you're happy. The wall covers me here, fine. If you're on 50th Street, you're like, well, wait a minute. What about me? Why did you stop the wall at 42nd Street? How come, what am I, chopped liver? Why don't I get protection too? And then, of course, if you're living, in somewhere like Queens or Brooklyn, lower income neighborhoods in New York, you don't have a $10 billion wall designed by a Danish architect protecting you, and you're like, well, what about me? Why do they get 10 billion and I don't get anything? So there's huge social equity issues related with building walls, in addition to the ecological things that it cuts off the shoreline from, any kind of the natural ecosystems along the shore destroyed. And there's also the question of the wall eventually being broached, as we saw in Hurricane Katrina. The walls broke, city floods. So you're dependent upon that wall. And then New Orleans is a great example of the limits. This is New Orleans, which we just spent, as everyone knows, it got wiped out in Hurricane Katrina, massive hurricane hit New Orleans. And we rebuilt New Orleans. We spent $14 billion building all of these kinds of dikes and all kinds of protections. And just last week, the Army Corps of Engineers, who did all the building of this, issued a report saying that because the Gulf is subsiding, sort of the way Jakarta is, although not quite as fast as Jakarta, all of this stuff is going down. So we only have 4 years of protection left for New Orleans. So they've spent all this time and money engineering this thing that is like going to be not worthless, but not going to give us protection like in 4 years. It's crazy. So what are they going to do? Like spend another $14 billion for 4 more years? And then how is that going to work, right? And what happens when the next hurricane comes? Are we going to just rebuild it again? What are we going to do? It's a great example of the limits of walls and of this kind of engineering. Venice is another great example. I went to Venice. Venice, many of you have been to, I'm sure, awesome city. As soon as I've been there before, but when I went there with the lens of sea level rise, as soon as I arrived, I took the boat from the airport over to the city, and I was like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. I love Venice. We made a mistake building cities on land. We should all be on the water. It's fabulous, and it is. It's a fabulous place. But of course, it is subsiding also. And they've sort of stopped this subsiding a little bit, but in order to protect Venice, because the water is rising, it's already low. I was there. I got jet lagged. I sat in Piazza San Marco, had my espresso. And while I was sitting in Piazza San Marco, like a foot of water comes running into the entire plaza. And nobody would even batted an eye. And I was like, what is going on? And of course, it was just high tide. It was just like this happens. And they bring out duck boards, and you walk along on the duck boards, and the city goes on. But it can't go on for long because this salt water and this inundation is having huge impacts on the structure, the brick and stone and concrete that is used the buildings are made of. So they built They spent 25 years engineering and designing this thing called the Mosey barrier, which one engineer described to me as the Ferrari on the seafloor, because it is a barrier that's highly engineered, that it's sunk down, and it only pops up like this when the seas are high and when there's a storm surge coming in. They spent almost $6.5 billion. About $1 billion of it went to ski condos and diamond rings for girlfriends of the contractors, and about 200 workers went to jail because of corruption. So there was a little. It was an Italian project, right? What can I say? But the big problem was not the guys who went to jail or the $1 billion that was lost in graft, but the fact that they didn't engineer it for sea level rise. So there's only about 8 inches of room for sea level rise. And after that, it doesn't do any good. The water will come right over it. So they've engineered this huge project that not only is questionable in the way it works, but is very questionable for the long term. It's not going to protect Venice. And so what are they going to do? Are they going to just rebuild Mosey in a few years, and when we get to beyond 8 inches of sea level rise, how is that going to work? It's a great example of the inflexibility of these large-scale engineering projects to protect places. And then there's the problem of airports. I mentioned that before, but it's, you can protect a city, you can protect a house, you can do things like this, but if you don't protect things like airports and infrastructure, ports and things like that, it doesn't do any good if your house or your community is elevated and things, but nobody can get there. And I know here in Singapore, they're raising the airports, they're building a new port, raising that and doing things like that. But there's not only just the raising the runways and things, there's also the access to the airports and how do you get there on the highways, and are those highways accessible, things like that. And Singapore has been way more forward thinking than many places on that, but in the US, many, many airports are in big trouble, and they can raise the runways, and that's doable, but it's the roads and everything getting there. And a great example of this to me is Norfolk Military Base. So I went to the Norfolk Military Base, which is the largest Navy base in the entire world. It's the head of all US operations for the Atlantic and for the Middle East. 6 aircraft carriers, who knows how many battleships and other things. 75,000 people work at this base. It's enormous. I went there with Secretary of State John Kerry a couple of times, and Secretary of State Kerry understood the risks of sea level rise and all this stuff very well. And I was standing with him on the deck of a battleship when he asked the head of the base, how much time does this base have because of the sea level rise and things? And he said 20 to 40 years. Which is mind-blowing when you can think about the consequences of having to move this base or deal with this base. But it's really a great example of, in a way, the trouble that Singapore is in, because the military can spend all the money they want building walls, elevating all of the piers, doing all the things on the improving drain, doing what they could elevate the base 12 feet with gold if they wanted to. They have enough money. I mean, the military gets what they want, right? So the issue of how do you build the base to be resilient or, protected from rising seas and things is not a problem. The problem is it doesn't do any good to have a fortress as a base if the railroads that bring the munitions and all the stuff to the base are all underwater. And if the roads getting to the base are all underwater, and if the house values of all the community around where these 75,000 people who work at the base live are all in radical decline because there's flooding there all the time. So the Navy has come to figure out that saving the base, they need to save the entire region, and they can't do that. So they're going to move the base. They haven't said this to anybody, but I'm telling you. Breaking news. It's not official, but of course they are going to have to move the base. And they're going to probably do it piecemeal. But it's a great example of so Singapore can do all the kinds of things that Singapore needs to do to protect itself, but if the whole region around it is in trouble also, it brings up a lot of questions about how you live on this island fortress. And so it's a much more complicated scenario than it would first appear. I just want to say one word about it. I wrote a book called How to Cool the Planet about geoengineering. I don't want to go into it in much detail because it's its own kind of nightmare can of worms. But I'll happily do that if you insist afterwards in the Q&A. But basically, there's this idea that we can cool off the planet by putting particles up in the stratosphere. And some people think about that as a solution for sea level rise, because you could cool off the planet enough to stop ice from melting in the poles. But 2 quick points about that. One is that there's all kinds of other consequences that are a nightmare for climate change, like ocean acidification and other things that are the consequence of high levels of CO2 that geoengineering would not take care of. It'll shift monsoons around, likely to shift monsoons around, which has huge consequences for food supply. And also, it's not going to do anything for Antarctica, for example, because the troubles there, as I explained, is coming from the warming ocean. You're not going to be able to cool the ocean with geoengineering. So geoengineering is not a fix either. Last point I want to make, because I realize all this is like really difficult to think about, but one of the things that I found in thinking about this and writing about this is that it's kind of exciting and great what's going on, in the sense that we're going to rethink how we live with water in a big, big way. And it's already happening in lots of places. And I saw lots of really cool, inspiring kinds of designs about how we will live with water that I found very inspiring. One was this community center in Lagos that was built by a Dutch-Nigerian architect. It was just a bunch of 55-gallon plastic barrels lashed together in this kind of cool, simple structure. But it was a really great example of a floating structure that was used as a community center in school for this water slum, and it worked great, and it made people were so happy, and it was just like a great use of space that nobody would have ever thought about if they weren't thinking about what do we do with water and how do we live differently with water. Unfortunately, it blew down in a big storm, but they're rebuilding it now with more, sort of sturdy, and it was always supposed to be just a prototype. But it's a great example of sort of inspired design. This is an architect friend of mine in Miami who's wants to build these platforms, thinking about these platform cities off the coast. I'm sure that this kind of thing, one way or another, will happen. People love living with water. There's no reason this kind of thing wouldn't work. He's using a lot of the same technology as oil rigs, the kinds of platform of drilling rigs can be applied into these other larger scales, especially in protected areas like this is in Biscayne Bay. So there's things like this that I'm sure are going to evolve. In New York, we've ditched the idea of building a wall, the one I talked about before, the Big U, and instead just 2 weeks ago, the mayor's office released a plan about basically filling in the East River some and the harbor, building some higher land and developing on top of that land, building new structures. So you're essentially building, land reclamation, something that you've done here in Singapore for many years. Most cities, San Francisco, New York, basically every coastal city has done a lot of that. But now they're thinking about doing it at just a higher level. So you're building a kind of perimeter around Lower Manhattan. Rather than a wall, you're building just the sort of city at a higher level around. And it's a way of securing financing too. And this is just a brand new plan that they just released. And then there's just the idea of building new land itself, which is something, again, you're, I'm sure, very familiar with. But this is the Maldives, where they've just pumping sand around and building new land. And that's, instead of dealing with the old city and the old problems, they're just starting all over again by building new land in the water. And we're seeing that kind of thing happen a lot. I saw they're doing exactly this in Lagos. I was there, I saw this new, it's about a 4 by 10 kilometer area right off the coast that they're building 30 feet higher, big seawalls all around it, very protected, selling it for sort of middle class, the growing middle class in Lagos as a protected place, not just from the water, but from the slums and all that kind of thing. And so it's building these kinds of sort of fortresses. But this is very doable, and the economics of it are sort of way different than trying to save old cities and things like that. So I think we're going to see a lot of new new land, new development in this way that will allow us to rethink everything about our relationship with the water. But I just want to wrap up with the big questions that this leaves me with when I think about what we're going to do and how we're going to handle this. And there's just a few things. One of them is, are we going to get serious about cutting carbon emissions? We haven't yet. For all the improvements in solar power prices, all the talk about, recycling and all the things that, the green everything. When you look at CO2 emissions and you look at parts per million in the atmosphere, we're still just shooting up. In fact, we're accelerating. So we're not even coming close to dealing with it on a serious level. As I said, we're not going to stop sea level rise by this, but we can change the long-term trajectory. And for a million reasons, which all of you know, it's really important to cut carbon as fast as possible. The goal now is 0 by 2050. We shall see. I'm not holding my breath, but I hope that happens. But that's one of the big questions when you think about what we're facing with rising seas in the coming years. When does the real estate market collide with climate science? When do people start doing what, as I mentioned before, saying, we're going to have 2 meters of sea level rise. We might have 2 meters of sea level rise. We might have more. We might have 1 meter. I don't want to be here and part of this. I'm going to get out of here. And this whole question of when the reality of what's happening, which is a certainty, get factored into the market. And I don't know when that will be. In some places might be tomorrow. In some places it might be 30 years. I don't know. But it's going to happen. And when it does, it's going to have a big impact on how we think about living in the coasts. Where's the money for adaptation going to come from? It's easy to think about where the money is going to come from for electric cars. Elon Musk, all these car companies, if you can displace internal combustion engines, you can make giant car companies and do great work. And it's easy to get venture capitalists and other kinds of investments in electric cars, solar panels, wind turbines. All these things have revenue streams. Hard to see what the revenue streams are for seawalls, for relocating houses, for elevating houses, all these kinds of things. The adaptation revenue model is very difficult to figure out. And governments are certainly not going to have the money to do it. Certainly in the United States, just even the money to deal with something like New Orleans is difficult to come up with. And when you think about all this happening and simultaneously in cities around the world, it's going to have to come from private capital somehow. And how that works and what the mechanisms for that are far from clear even now. How quickly are we going to stop building walls and living with water, which is inevitable? Even the Dutch, who have 1,000 years of experience with living with water and have done a very good job of building dikes and things to keep water out, are realizing that they can't do that anymore. The era, I think wall building is a very 20th century idea, and a lot of the best thinking I'm hearing about now is about living with water, floating structures, adjustable structures, all kinds of things. But when that transition happens, I think we'll have a big impact on how we think about this. And I think the other big question is who decides what and who and what will be saved. I mean, one of the things that's, a simple way of putting this that a friend of mine said to me, who's interested in historic preservation in the United States, said we can only save so many lighthouses. As the seas come up, a lot of stuff is going to be inundated, and a lot of historic homes, a lot of everything is going to be inundated, and we'll be able to save some stuff, presumably, and some stuff we won't, because the economics are just going to be impossible to deal with. So this question of how we make these decisions, what we decide to save, what we decide not to save, what parts of New York do we protect, what parts, how far do we put the wall, how much do we do to move people out of areas, relocate people, inevitable kind of retreat that's going to happen. That is a very, very difficult political decision that is going to have big impact on the sort of trajectory of all this. So, there we go. Thank you very much. I'm happy to have a conversation right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Maybe you can take a seat first. May I invite Professor Chow on stage for the discussion and Q&A. So Prof. Chow will be opening up the floor for questions after the discussion. Please hold your questions till then. During the Q&A, I would like to request for your help to raise your hand and wait for the cue from Prof. Chow, and then shout out the question as clearly as you can, because our mic runners cannot get to you at all. Yes. So Jeff, Prof. Chow, please.
Yeah, thanks. Jeff, wonderful talk. Thanks. Okay, before we begin, first, I think it's fair to say I'll speak on behalf of the organizers and for Jeff to thank you all for coming down here on a Friday afternoon to listen to a very important topic. It's seating, well, all the seats are taken. I think we calculated there were about 25% above capacity. So if there's a fire alert, we may have to bear that little risk. But compared to the risks that what Jeff talked about in his presentation, I think they are rather minimal. Okay, so I'll give you a heads up. This audience here is a very diverse one. You've got the old and the young. You've got a whole bunch of very learned people. You've got your work cut out for you in terms of the questions they can ask. Okay, so as I have my own questions, but because for the interest of time, I'm not going to ask them. I'm going to open the floor. Are there any questions from anyone who would like to get the ball rolling? The gentleman over there first, and okay. Can you shout it out, and I'll try and repeat it.
There are three options to solve this problem. First, send the warship to Iran and stop oil exportation. Reduce oil. Second, the Finland solution. Bury carbon dioxide underground so that you will not be decomposed and become a toxin and leak out. Third, cultivate ponds in the desert and produce good income for the desert farmer. This was suggested to Chinese government in 2006. 2007, they enacted law prohibit food for energy and started cultivating ponds in Inner Mongolia. 2009, the ponds was harvested. So, how to convert carbon dioxide into plants? Or how to go around all these very complex issues of corruption in Venice or, landfill. Because landfill, I think China is very good in South China Sea. Maybe you can work with them instead of picking fight with him, right? Making friends is better. Okay. Making friends with environment is the best. I thank you. Yeah. The question is, three solutions to do. Bury carbon dioxide underground, stop using fossil fuel, or cultivating ponds or plants in the desert and converting.
So, sir, I assume the question is directed to Jeff, and what are your views on? You can take it, it's okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, right. I guess the main point is that, what we're talking about, as I tried to suggest, is that this stuff is going to happen no matter what we do with carbon dioxide right now. And, even if we stopped burning carbon dioxide tomorrow and whatever we did with Iran or whatever and buried it all, I mean, if we could figure out a way to extract carbon from the atmosphere, that would be a really good thing. I've written a lot about this. I know of people who are starting companies to do this, but it's very expensive, very complex, not going to happen in any time scenarios or any kind of economics that are going to sort of save us. So I'm all for lowering carbon and extracting carbon and all that, but the reality is we're going to have to deal with these changes, and we should start thinking about that.
Okay. Can I, there's a gentleman on the right.
The solution has been implemented in 2006 and profitable in 2006.
Okay, maybe we can discuss this later, but a lot of other very learned individuals want to ask questions. So.
Okay, I really wish Chinese government never take this suggestion, but it's a separate issue. I would like to, Jeff, ask you a question. You say we're going to live in the sea. What happens if the sea is not livable? So water is not livable. You already mentioned when you walk on the Miami beach, the bacteria is how many times above. You think about climate change. So I'm not so optimistic than this gentleman. You ask ourselves, what happens if water is fully polluted? Imagine if the climate change, the temperature go up, all the fish are dying. What's the consequences? And what you must know now that our ocean is fully polluted by plastic, especially this microplastic. The microplastic all going to the different fish. We eat the fish, you perhaps swallow the microplastic as well. This is only one thing. The second thing we're coming, which is nanoparticle. Okay? And the another thing is antibiotic resistance, bacteria. So all this will eventually pollute our environment as well as the sea. So my question to you is, you ask us, you suggest we should move to the sea. What happens if the sea is not livable? Thank you.
Gosh, I was feeling so optimistic at the end of my talk. So, you know, I don't, I would never underestimate the pollution of the ocean. I spent a lot of time around the ocean, and I know about the problems of plastics and all that kind of thing, and pollution. But, you know, the notion that the water will be so toxic that we can't, you know, live on it and have, you know, floating structures and stuff, I think is a little beyond. I think that, you know, what's happening in the ocean is a tragedy. I just went diving with my daughter at the Great Barrier Reef because I wanted her to see it before it all goes away. I just spent 2 months out in the Southern Ocean with ocean scientists. I know about the risks and the problems of the ocean, but I don't think it's going to become such a toxic soup in the near term that we can't live around it. We might not be able to, the fish might be dead, but or less fish. I certainly will be, but I don't think it's going to be so toxic that the idea of living on water is going to be implausible.
Yeah, I think the risk from plastic pollution is high, but there's a more urgent risk from ocean acidification on top of warmer sea surface temperatures that have directly affected places such as the Great Barrier Reef and other places which are tourism hotspots. So settlements and you know, industries that really derive a lot of their income and their livelihoods from those natural resources. They face a more near-term risk from that as opposed to plastic pollution. Okay, could I have questions from this lady here first? And
it seems to me that trying to save the populations that are living close or at sea level might be an insurmountable problem. So is there a conversation going on today at government levels and people as to how to move millions of people further inland and abandoning the areas that are going to be flooded?
That's a really good question, and the answer, as far as I know, is no. There needs to be that kind of discussion because there's an inevitability of retreat from these areas, and there's an inevitability that there are going to be a lot of people at risk who need to be moved out of low-lying areas for various economic reasons, and others won't or can't go on their own. I think that the economics of this are going to force certain areas to be abandoned. It's already happening, I know, in southern Florida. They're deciding not to build new roads, not to put new water lines into places because they know that it's not going to be around for long. So that is already happening in a kind of quiet way. But the idea of what you're talking about is something that is referred to by people who talk about this as managed retreat. The idea that we're going to think intelligently about, okay, this place is not going to be sustainable in a decade or two, so we're going to start moving people away, and we're going to do the sort of rational thing. Is not happening. I wish it were. It's not happening. I mean, there's been buyouts in areas in the U.S. after hurricanes and things like that because it's been too expensive to rebuild some neighborhoods. But the idea of actually admitting that you were going to have to abandon an area and putting in place the economics and the politics of doing that is just, it's just politically very difficult to do, and it's not happening. So, no.
to add on to that, remember you mentioned the example of New Orleans, right? So there was some discussion, at least among some scientists, very quietly, obviously not political, about what isn't the best option just retreating away from that part of Louisiana? But on top of those elements that you talked about, there's also the cultural element. There's a lot of a massive cultural heritage in the French Quarter of New Orleans that people are very resistant to move, and they are willing to take the risk of staying there even though it'll be underwater in the future.
I mean, there's examples, yeah, exactly. And there's examples of cities where they've tried to do buyouts of people, and they're like offering them 25% above market value for their houses, and they won't go. They're just like, I don't care. You can give me twice as much, and I'm not going because I love where I live, and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather have lived here, and I'm going down with the ship.
We're not rational, I'm afraid. Okay, there was a question from this lady here.
That exists now, or do you think that we should really be focusing on managed retreat? Do you think it's feasible to actually move forward with living with water?
So the question is whether we can currently cope with rising sea levels as opposed to a managed retreat.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the complicated things about this whole question of what we can do and what we can't do is that every place is different, right? So some places, you know, you can protect a lot of things by building walls, and even though I don't think building walls is necessarily a good thing, but some places it's a real viable option. Some places like Miami, it's totally not a viable option. Some places, because of the geography, because of the way bays or something are structured, you can imagine doing a lot of things that can protect it and allow, you know, whether it's just protection from water or floating cities or things like that. And then some places that are such open water that you can't, because it's, you know, you have, you know, for floating structures you need protected areas. You can't, I mean, you can build them out in the middle of the rougher seas, but that increases the complexity of it in a big way. But the main point is that every place is different. So there's no, the politics are different, the culture is different, the economics are different. So it's really hard, and that's one of the reasons why it's hard to think about revenue streams and stuff too, because everywhere is different. If you could just, somebody could invent an inflatable seawall that you could just put up everywhere, that would be really cool. You know, Elon Musk, please do this, right? But it's not going to happen because there's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And that makes it very complicated, because then the engineering lessons from one place, like the Dutch, you know, they're going around the world right now and doing a lot of engineering consulting on cities, and that's great, and they have a lot of knowledge and they're doing a lot of good things. But what works in the Netherlands doesn't necessarily work everywhere else. And so that is what makes it complicated.
Okay, questions? The gentleman I've asked from this side, can I, the gentleman in the purple shirt? Yes, you.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Chris. I'm from Climate Conversations. Thank you. You and some of the questions have hinted at like the societal challenge that this poses and how easily the societal response can undermine our ability to act effectively on this. And I wondered if you'd come across examples where society has responded to this really well, or collectively, or in a community sense, and is that replicable? Are there lessons that we can learn and take to other parts of the world in terms of how we prepare society to adapt?
Well, I'm thinking about this in the context of sea level rise. I mean, you know, more broadly, you know, the sort of movement of youth movements around the world right now with, you know, Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise Movement in the U.S., all that is really inspiring and you know, bringing a lot of political pressure on to think about this in a sort of more real-time kind of way. But when you think about communities coming together, I mean, you know, it's interesting in South Florida, you have a kind of regional compact that's come together to do a lot of thinking about what can happen in South Florida. And it's interesting because it's within the context of a state where you have a governor who basically has banned, until recently with the election, banned the word climate change from any kind of state documents. You have a president who thinks this is all a Chinese hoax, and you know, but within that, they've taken control of their own destiny to a way, and they're beginning to organize and try to sort of draw attention to this and implement changes and things on their own. But it's really hard because to do more, when it comes to sea level rise, to do more than a kind of plan or something, because it's frankly expensive and it's not something that you can just do like put in recycling or something. You know, it requires federal, state, it requires money, and it requires like, you know, more than just organization. And I'm sure there are examples of places that are doing it, but nothing that really like leaps to mind as a shining example of how this can get done. I also think that, I mean, it's really important to say that this is all new, right? I mean, 5 years ago even, people were not really thinking about this. And I mean, like I said, I've been writing about this for 20 years. The change in the last few years is huge, right? Just in the public awareness of it. I mean, like I said, there would have been 5 people here 10 years ago, and now this is full. And I think that also applies to this idea of like communities organizing. I think people are just like waking up and beginning to say, oh my God, we got to do, what are we going to do? And so that is just beginning.
Can I follow up on that gentleman's question? Because you gave examples of, you know, paragons or shining examples of, you know, understanding the risks. But in your book, there was that one example from Florida or Miami about people who are on the other end of the spectrum who don't give a crap about climate change.
I never met anybody like that.
Can you just tell us the other side of the coin instead of people who are aware of the risk? How about the people who don't care about it at all?
Yeah, there's a few of them in America. One of them is in the Oval Office. A lot of them are in the U.S. Senate, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's stunning to me. And you know, there's this question of willful denial and whatnot. And the best example of this that I will tell you about is a encounter I had with the biggest developer in South Florida, a man named George Perez, who's known as the Trump of the tropics. And who's a Democrat and a very progressive guy, supports a lot of progressive things, and he's not like a, you know, completely kind of head in his sand, culturally, you know, kind of guy. He's very attuned to things. He's a big art collector. In fact, the biggest art museum, or the most well-known art museum in Miami, is called the Perez Museum of Art. A very beautiful building right on the water, and it's probably the best example of how to build a building that is resilient to sea level rise. It's elevated. It's got there's many qualities of it. But anyway, I was there for an art opening one night for a friend of mine who does art about sea level rise and about things. And George Perez happened to be there. And so I had been trying to talk to him before, and he wouldn't answer my calls or anything. But I went up to him and I complimented him on the art museum that bore his name and how well designed it was. And he sort of shrugged and was like, yeah, I don't know. I didn't have anything to do with that. I just gave him money and put my name on it. And I was like, oh, okay, well. And I said, well, George, I need to ask you, you know, you're the biggest developer in South Florida. You know, you're aware of, you know, seas are rising. You're a smart guy. How's this changed, you know, how you think about development? How's it changed where you think you're going to build properties and stuff? And he just looked at me and sort of shrugged and said, you know, I don't think about it. I build to code. And I said, really? Seriously? You know, isn't this going to have an impact? And don't you think about your legacy of these buildings? And he looked at me and said, what do I care? I'll be dead by then. But, you know, and then the Miami Herald, when my book came out, the Miami Herald went to him, the big paper in Miami, went to him and said, really, George Perez, you don't really care about this? And he said, oh, I was drunk when I said that to Jeff. Okay. He wasn't drunk. But that's sort of emblematic of the kind of denial that you feel. I mean, it's one thing to feel like, you know, in America we have people who think that God put coal on earth for humans to burn, right? That's why it's here, because God put it there and we're supposed to burn it. I kind of understand that kind of denial because it's based on religious faith and everything. When people like George Perez who say things like that, it's just willful ignorance and selfishness, you know, in a way that is emblematic of a lot of the thinking on this issue, frankly. It's like, I got to get mine, and then we'll let everybody else to hell with them, right?
It's frightening, indeed. Okay, question here from this lady.
Hi, I'm from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. So my city is not the most well-planned city, so I'm actually excited that there might be an opportunity to build something completely new. the question then would be on whose water we'll be able to use. I'm just curious if you have seen any sort of conversations economically, politically about, if we go out to the coast of Vietnam, that's going to be the South China Sea. So how, any thoughts you've thought?
You mean about territorial issues with
Like, on which piece of the ocean we're going to try to imagine it's possible to build something new now?
That's a very interesting question that I have not looked into. But I mean, there are all kinds of interesting property rights issues, and I'm of course most familiar with it from the U.S. point of view. About once you own property and then it goes underwater, do you still own it? Is it still your land when it's 3 feet underwater or not? And those are very muddy kind of legal questions. Obviously most countries have territorial waters off the coast for whatever the miles it is, or kilometers it is. 12, yeah. Presumably so Vietnam would have territorial waters out however many kilometers. Beyond that, about ownership and all the rights, property rights, that's like some law students need to start thinking about that, because it's a real issue. I mean, it's a real question, but I have no idea about the answer.
Especially if there are certain, shall we say, extractable natural resources that have no governance there. That will be a big problem. Okay, we've got questions from the front. Can I have questions from the back, if you don't mind? The gentleman in the middle, then on the right. If you could shout it out and I can...
Yes.
Okay. Saw you, sir. Okay.
Thank you. So the issues that we just discussed was in fact the subject of a world conference that we had on the 22nd and the 23rd at the National University of Singapore, at which there were professors from Norway, Holland, Japan, Korea, and several other countries, and we addressed the issues that were discussed here and many more. It is possible to build floating structures, and this, I think, is the only solution possible for rising sea waters, sea levels. It also is a solution for carbon sequestration by using algae to absorb the CO2. The Dutch have in fact experimenting in their test tanks a 3 million square meters of floating island. And the project manager was in fact giving a paper at that conference.
Okay, sir, thanks for that comment. Is there a question that you'd like to address?
There's not a question. I just want to use the opportunity to draw the attention of the audience that there is such a society, and we hope that you contact us, that we can share solutions, whoever is interested. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman on my right. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Goodell. I noticed when you presented the Louisiana photo and screenshot, you have not highlighted the eutrophication that's going on in the Florida area and Louisiana area from the use of toxic chemical-based fertilizer, the eutrophication. Thank you.
Is there a question? Or
yeah, that's my question. Because there's nothing to show that at the moment, besides the plastic solution, the next biggest problem is actually the use of a chemical-based fertilizer from the agriculture industry in USA. After a runoff from rains and watering, it goes into the water system. And today, the problem is bigger than the plastic problem. Eutrophication from the use of NPK fertilizer. Thank you.
Okay. Is it a bigger problem then than sea level rise of plastics? Could be.
I don't want to get into a competition of whose problem is bigger, but I mean, it certainly is an issue. They had the green sludge in Florida that was related to some of this. You know, there's many pollution problems. I'm trying to speak specifically about, you know, the issue of sea level rise.
Yes.
It does not denigrate any of the other problems that there are. There are many of them that we could talk about for quite a while, but I'm just trying to focus on one part of it.
Okay, question from the gentleman in front here.
I have a question on the dichotomy between climate refugees and social resilience, i.e. Memory. Because in Asian cities, a lot of refugees are moving into the cities and straining the infrastructure, unlike in Florida, which is the reverse. And likewise, I've been to Rockaway on the shoreline of the resilience and look at the devastation by Hurricane Sandy. But it seems to me that there's some sense of pride in the social resilience among the people. The community come together, create emergency preparedness. And in the sense, memory was retained. Right. So in making the new civilized world that we want to go into for coastal cities and nations like us, how do you deal with this intangible, the memory part?
That is, you know, a great question in the sense that sea level rise in particular, the stuff I'm talking about, you know, one of the big themes is loss. We're going to lose a lot of things. And memories, and, you know, one of the most moving conversations I've had about this is about a friend of mine, well, not a friend, someone, an acquaintance who I was talking to at a party one night, and he basically, you know, was talking about his house that on the Jersey Shore that his great-grandfather had built from like scrap lumber and had been in his family for like 60 years or 70 years or something. And the idea that this, his father, his children had all been at this house, had all spent time there. It meant everything to them. And all of their sort of family memories were in this house. And the notion that it was going to go away was just, he couldn't bear it. And you know, he was just talking about the incredible pain of that, and what does he do? Does he sell it? Does he try to pick it up and move it? How do you deal with these memories? And this kind of loss that we're going to feel as things go away, which is going to happen, is the greatest example of this is some of the Pacific Islands, yes. Right? You have entire countries, cultures, Marshall Islands that are, you know, Kiribati, other places that are entirely at risk. I mean, where do they go? Yes, they can move to high land on Fiji or something, but are they still the Marshall Islands living on Fiji? And what does that mean? Do they keep their language? Do they keep their culture? I mean, how you deal with loss, I don't know. I mean, there are, you know, people who are doing virtual reality projects trying to, you know, map and preserve things that way. But I think the psychological impacts of that are enormous. And you know, I think it's a really unremarked on part of this. And I've felt the emotions a lot in people that I've talked to about it.
Related to that, there's some research on Pacific Islanders from Kiribati and from the Marshall Islands, in that compounded with what Jeff said, is also that they view themselves as resilient and they don't want to leave. They don't want to be viewed as victims to move to, let's say, Australia or someplace else. They have their own culture there. And when people interview them, they said, no, we are people of the sea. We face the sea. We don't want to leave. We've handled this before in our past. My grandfathers and great-grandfathers have handled this. We can handle this. And they feel that cultural aspect of, you know, resilience is there for Pacific Islanders. They don't want to be refugees. Okay, question from this gentleman.
Are there areas of great ecological importance where we're trying to mitigate sea level rise, and regardless, do you think there's an economic incentive to do so?
So the question is on areas of ecological importance and whether they can be rescued or prioritized? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
You mean ecological regions that are at risk because of sea level rise? I mean, yes. I mean, you know, I would argue that, you know, many places you can think of, the Gulf Coast, Florida, Chesapeake Bay region. I mean, all of these, ecosystems are hugely at risk and will be changing. I mean, the great example of this, sorry to be so U.S.-centric, but that's what I've been thinking about, that's where I'm from, is Florida and the Everglades. I mean, the Everglades are a national park. They are a very unique ecosystem. We are spending in the U.S. millions and millions of dollars to try to save the Everglades. The Everglades are totally doomed. There's no saving the Everglades. And what does that mean for that entire ecosystem? I mean, I've spent a lot of time there. It's an incredible place, very unique place in the world, and it's gone because as it's a brackish ecosystem, half fresh water, half salt water. As the salt water inundates, gets more and more, it changes everything. So, and there's no scenario to protect it. You're not going to build dikes and things to protect the Everglades. And so that's another very unremarked upon loss that we're going to be seeing here. And, it goes to this broader question that our world is changing fast, and that's a great example of it.
Oh, that's very pessimistic, Jeff.
Well, what do you mean? Pessimistic that our world is changing fast, or pessimistic that we're going to lose the?
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
I'm just reporting the physics. I'm not like.
I've asked the organizers for time, maybe for 2 more questions. If that gentleman there can ask, hopefully it's an optimistic one.
Assuming that URA and LTA here in Singapore is planning to build more underground open space, adding to upper space in Singapore, is there a way that both underground and overground and above ground facades together as a skyscraper can get adapted to the rising sea levels at all?
Sounds like a very local question. Can I answer this one?
Sure.
Short answer is I think yes, as long as the resources are there, because the plan for Singapore to adapt to rising sea levels starts at the coast. So it's not a managed retreat. We actually adapt to rising sea levels by building either seawalls or dealing with the threat from rising sea levels immediately from the outside. So in the interest of time, I'll just say the short answer is yes, but it will be expensive. Okay, all right. One last question. Can I ask from the back? So can you shout? Yeah, can you shout out the question, please? So the question, if you couldn't hear, is what extent would insurance or reinsurance companies be part of the solution for climate change and sea level rise?
Well, insurance companies play a really important role. And one of the big problems, certainly in the US and I think globally, is that how the risk is priced, right? And in the US, we have most flood insurance in the US is through the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a government-run program, which is horribly mismanaged. And in fact has a perverse incentive of encouraging people to rebuild in low-lying areas and doesn't reflect the risk of sea level rise. And you're shaking your head, you know about all this, right? So I've talked a lot to people in the insurance business. They understand this very well. But the politics of this are very complicated because you have a lot of people who are living in low-lying areas who are middle income or lower income people who are basically have been living for decades with subsidized insurance rates. And if you all of a sudden say, well, you know what, it's time to you pay the real risk, the real price of the risk, which would have a big impact on helping people move out of areas because they would say, oh, you know what, it's $20,000 a year for insurance or something, I'm going to move away, which is sort of what you want because you want people to have a kind of incentive to retreat. But they don't. If they try to raise these rates, they go bananas because they say, I've been paying $75 a year for the last 10 years, and now you want me to pay $10,000, you know? So no, and they call their politician, and the politician calls the National Flood Insurance Program and says, you have to fix this, and they fix it. So the insurance would be a big incentive towards I'm all about, I think the most important thing, one of the most important things that can happen is transparency of risk. I think people should live on the coast if they want to live on the coast. I think that people should, as long as they understand the risk, and if they had insurance that were priced accurately, that would reflected that risk, it would really help a lot to help people make decisions about how they wanted to deal with this. But at least in the US, it's very perverted. But it's not sustainable, that perversion. And it's going to be readjusted, and I think that would be a really good thing. But at a certain point, the risks from inundation and things get so big that insurance becomes sort of beyond real, right? In fact, I was at an event a month ago where the head of one of the major, in fact, one of the biggest reinsurance companies in the world told me that with 4 degrees of warming, which is sort of where we're heading, the world is uninsurable because the volatility is so huge. And this is the head of one of the biggest reinsurance companies in the world. And when you think about the implications of that, that is a big deal.
Actually, I would say the risk will be even larger, not at 4, but at lower temperatures, maybe 3 or less.
Yeah.
That's the worrying thing. Can I beg the organizers' time for one last question, because there are so many? We have time for one last one. Yep.
Hi, so first of all, thank you both for being here. I have 2 questions, just a very quick one. The first one is, how wise do you think it is to frame the discourse of climate change and its effects such as sea level rise in such catastrophic terms? So we talk about like sea level rise and the collapse of civilization, and I ask this personally because I feel that moments of crisis actually bring out the worst in humans. And look at what the Syrian refugee crisis did to Europe, for example. And my second question is, what do you suggest that individuals, meaning everyone in this room, can do right now to tackle the problem of climate change? Thank you.
Good way to end the discussion.
Yeah. I'm going to end on a very happy note. Well, first of all, I'm not a political strategist. I'm a journalist, and I feel like my job is to tell the truth about the physics of what's happening, about climate science and the risk as well as I can. I'm not trying to organize a political movement. I'm not trying to, I feel like my job is to basically be as blunt as I can about what I know about the risks that we face. I don't think it's a catastrophe. I think that it's a catastrophe for some people. I think I made clear at the end that there's a lot of hope about rethinking our relationship with water. I don't even think that climate change is broadly. I'm not a catastrophist about that. I think that we will manage our way through it. But I also think that there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering and economic loss. And the more we're aware of that, the more we're aware that we might see 2 meters, 3 meters of sea level rise and begin to think and prepare for that, the better we can make choices about alleviating some of that suffering and make better choices for the future. So I don't think of myself as a catastrophist, and if I came off that way, I didn't mean to. I apologize. But I think it's really important to tell the truth, and I'm trying to tell the truth as best as I can. As to what you can do, I'm a firm believer. I don't like plastic straws. I don't like plastic in the water. A lot of things I don't like. But that's not the problem in this context. What the problem with all of this, in my view, with what we're going to do about climate change and sea level rise in particular, is it's all political right now. We have the technology to deal with all of this stuff. It's not an alien invasion. We don't need gamma ray guns or anything like that. We need political will to take on these challenges, both on the energy side and the adaptation side. So what I would say to anybody who asks me what to do is get politically involved. Get whatever the method you want to use is to pressure politicians, political leaders, to take stronger action on this is what you need to do. That's way more important than whether you use a plastic straw or not.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. To add on to that, part of before you actually get involved in political action is communication and education. As far as in the North American context, climate change is in the back burner, environmental destruction is in the back burner. Like last week, the UN had the Global Biodiversity Report that came out that said 1 million species are threatened with extinction. 4 days later, what people are talking about is the name of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's kid. That's more important compared to the loss of millions of species. The knowledge of what's happening to our planet has to be front and center. Has to be people have to be aware of that. if you're an educator, talk to your students. If you're a parent, talk to your children about it. You'll be surprised at how cognizant they are of the challenges they will inherit from us. The other thing to also add is it's not just political as well. A recent report said that the top 100 emitters of CO2 are, in terms of industrial emissions, they contribute like 71% of emissions since 1985. They're all mostly coal or fossil fuel industries. And you can pressure them by being aware of what you purchase, being aware of where your energy sources come from. So people don't respond to, if people don't respond to rational behavior, they can respond economically as well. So that's another thing that one can consider. Okay, I guess that's all we have time for. It leaves me to, if we could join our hands and thank Jeff again for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you all for coming. It's really great. It's amazing. This is something that inspires me and gives me hope, is seeing all of you here. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Prof. Chow. Thank you also to the audience for joining us in this lively discussion. May I invite Mr. Kutin Chai, the Executive Director of Center for Livable Cities, to present the token of appreciation to the speaker and the moderator, please. Okay, thank you for being a part of today's event. We hope you have enjoyed the lecture. For the latest updates on our lecture series and our publications, do visit our website or follow us on Facebook at CLC SG. Have a good weekend ahead.